Stand at the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street today, and you see nothing, or rather, you see everything that replaced what once stood here: glass towers reflecting an indifferent sky, luxury apartments where investment bankers sleep above the dreams of Gilded Age titans, tourists streaming past with coffee cups and smartphones, oblivious to the ghosts beneath their feet. But if you could peel back the layers of time like old wallpaper, if you could strip away the concrete and steel and digital noise, you would find yourself facing something impossible, something that defied every principle of democratic America, something so audaciously opulent that it makes today's billionaire penthouses look like college dormitories. You would be standing before the Mrs. Astor house, the physical embodiment of American aristocracy, a French chateau dropped onto Manhattan. Bedrock by a woman who believed she could outqueen the Queen of England, and you would understand immediately why it had to die. This is not a story about beautiful buildings lost to progress. This is a story about power so absolute it could reshape an entire city's geography, about wealth so vast it became its own gravitational force, bending society itself into orbit around a single ballroom, and about the inevitable, brutal reckoning that comes when a nation built on the rhetoric of equality allows a hereditary aristocracy to flourish in plain sight, because what happened to Mrs. Astor's palace, and to the dozens of marble monuments that lined 5th Avenue like tombstones to Republican virtue, was not merely architectural change but something closer to ritual execution, a violent erasure that speaks to America's deepest contradictions about wealth, class, and who deserves to be remembered. The cold open to this story begins not with construction but with destruction. February 1926, and the wrecking crews arrive at 840 5th Avenue with sledgehammers and dynamite, ready to tear down what had taken years to build and decades to perfect. And if you listen closely to the historical record, you can hear something unsettling in the speed and efficiency of the demolition, a kind of savage glee in the newspaper accounts, as if the city itself was taking revenge on a woman who had dared to play queen in a republic, who had stood at the top of a marble staircase and decided which Americans mattered and which did not, who had transformed social acceptance into a commodity more valuable than gold and more ruthlessly controlled than any monopoly Rockefeller ever dreamed of. And the question that haunts this entire story, the question that the rubble of 5th Avenue demands we answer, is this: what does it mean that we built these palaces, that we allowed a handful of families to accumulate not just wealth but the architectural vocabulary of European monarchy, to plant feudal fantasies in the heart of Manhattan? And then what does it mean that we destroyed them so completely, so thoroughly, that most Americans today have never heard of Mrs. Astor's house, have no idea that their grandparents once gawked at ballrooms that could swallow entire tenement buildings, have forgotten that 5th Avenue was once a 3-mile monument to inequality so grotesque it would make a pharaoh blush? The answer, like everything about the Gilded Age, is complicated, morally tangled, and far darker than the society pages ever admitted, because behind every palazzo and chateau-inspired mansion, behind every Canstone facade and every imported marble staircase, behind every crystal chandelier and every servant in livery, there was a structure of exploitation so vast and so normalized that it became invisible. The coal miners who died in Pennsylvania to heat these ballrooms, the immigrant laborers who built the mansions for wages that couldn't feed their families, the Irish maids who scrubbed floors on their knees for 16 hours a day, the black servants who were hired specifically because their skin color reinforced the racial hierarchies their employers believed in, the garment workers in tenement sweatshops who sewed the ball gowns and morning coats, the children who sorted rags and picked through garbage while Mrs. Astor decided whether to serve champagne or sherry at her next dinner for 40 intimate friends. And to understand Mrs. Astor's house, to really see it with clear eyes, you have to hold two truths simultaneously. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a masterpiece of design and craftsmanship that represented the peak of 19th-century architectural ambition, and it was also a monument to theft, a palace built on the systematic extraction of wealth from working people who would never see the inside of its gates, let alone its ballroom. And both of these things are true, and the tension between them is what makes this story so compelling and so disturbing, because we want our architectural heritage to be innocent. We want to separate the beauty of the object from the ugliness of its creation, but 5th Avenue won't let us do that. The palaces themselves, in their very existence, were arguments about power, were physical manifestations of the belief that some people deserved to live like gods while others deserved to live like animals, and when they came down, when the wrecking balls swung and the marble shattered, that was also an argument, a counter-argument, a violent rejection of everything those buildings represented. And yet here we are, a century later, in an age of even greater inequality, building new towers for new oligarchs, and the ghosts of 5th Avenue are asking us, have you learned nothing? Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into a world that no longer exists, a New York that was still recognizably Dutch in character, where Manhattan ended at 14th Street and everything north was farmland and country estates, where society was small enough that everyone who mattered knew everyone else who mattered, and were the old Knickerbocker families, the Schermerhorns, Van Rensselaers, Livingstons, and Stuyvesants, still believed that their colonial-era pedigrees gave them permanent claim to social supremacy, but Caroline would live long enough to see that world devoured by a new one, a world of unimaginable wealth created not by land grants and inherited property but by railroads and steel and oil, by the brutal genius of men like Vanderbilt and Carnegie and Rockefeller, men whose grandfathers had been farmers or peddlers, men with no breeding and no manners and no respect for the old families, and Caroline Schermerhorn, who would become Mrs. Astor, who would become the Mrs. Astor, the only Mrs. Astor who mattered, would spend her entire adult life fighting a desperate, brilliant, ultimately futile battle to maintain the supremacy of birth over wealth, to prove that bloodlines mattered more than bank accounts, to establish that society was not for sale to the highest bidder, and the magnificent irony, the dark joke at the heart of her story, is that she would fail completely in this mission even as she appeared to succeed, because the palace she built, the social machinery she constructed, the system of balls and calling cards and lists and exclusions, all of it would be captured and repurposed by exactly the kind of new money industrialists she despised, and her grandson would marry a Vanderbilt, the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that in America, money always wins, breeding is just a story the rich tell themselves, and aristocracy is whatever the current generation of billionaires decides it is. Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, becoming part of a family that had already accumulated almost unimaginable wealth. William's grandfather, John Jacob Astor, the German immigrant for trader, had systematically bought up Manhattan real estate in the early 1800s when it was cheap, and then simply held it as the city exploded northward, becoming America's first multimillionaire through the simple expedient of owning the land everyone else needed, a perfect example of what economists call unearned increment, wealth created not by labor or innovation but by the collective efforts of an entire city channeled into private hands through the magic of property rights. And by the time Caroline entered the family, the Astors were so rich that they barely needed to do anything except collect rent and watch their fortune multiply. But here was the problem: money alone, no matter how vast, did not automatically confer social position in 1850s New York, where the old Knickerbocker family still controlled access to respectability, still decided who was received in good society and who was not, and the Astors, despite their fortune, were still seen as somewhat vulgar, tainted by trade, not quite acceptable in the best drawing rooms, and this social ambiguity would haunt Caroline, would drive her to create a social system so rigid and so powerful that no one would ever again question whether the Astors belonged at the top. William Backhouse Astor Jr., Caroline's husband, was by all accounts a profoundly uninteresting man. He enjoyed his yachts, his horses, and his mistresses, in approximately that order, and he was perfectly content to let his wife manage the tedious business of social climbing while he enjoyed the fruits of inherited wealth. But his very mediocrity was, in a sense, Caroline's opportunity, because a more ambitious or socially engaged husband might have interfered with her plans, might have had his own ideas about how to position the family, whereas William's indifference gave Caroline complete freedom to construct the elaborate social machinery that would eventually make her the most powerful woman in New York, and in constructing that machinery, she would reveal something essential about American society that we still haven't fully processed, that in the absence of official titles and formal aristocracy, someone will always step in to create informal structures that do the same work. That human beings seem to need hierarchy the way they need food and shelter, that the egalitarian rhetoric of American democracy has always existed in tension with the reality of American practice, and that Mrs. Astor understood this tension better than any of her contemporaries, understood that Americans would accept and even celebrate a hereditary elite as long as you didn't call it that, as long as you wrapped it in the language of taste and culture and refinement rather than the language of law and title. The house that would become the Mrs. Astor house, the physical stage for her social theater, was not built all at once but emerged through a process that itself tells us something important about the evolution of Fifth Avenue. Originally, in 1859, William's father built two brownstone houses on the west side of Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets, one for William and Caroline and one for William's brother John Jacob Astor III, but Caroline was not satisfied with a mere brownstone, no matter how large, because brownstone was what prosperous merchants lived in, what doctors and lawyers lived in, what people with comfortable but not extraordinary wealth lived in, and Caroline was building something else, something unprecedented in Republican America, and so over the years she pushed and renovated and expanded, transforming the original structure into something grander. But the real transformation came in 1893 when her nephew William Waldorf Astor, in a spectacular act of family warfare that perfectly captures the viciousness beneath the Gilded Age's polite surface, deliberately built the Waldorf Hotel on the site of his father's house next door, placing a commercial hotel, a place where anyone with money could stay, where the barriers between classes dissolved in the democracy of the hotel lobby, directly adjacent to Mrs. Astor's residence, a calculated insult designed to drive her away. And it worked, because in 1895 Caroline began planning a new house further north, at 5th Avenue and 65th Street, in what was then still a relatively undeveloped area, and this new house, completed in 1896, would be her masterpiece. Her final statement, the physical embodiment of everything she believed about power and position and the proper ordering of society. To build the new Mrs. Astor house, Caroline hired Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had created Biltmore for the Vanderbilts and who had essentially invented the American practice of building French Renaissance chateaux for industrial millionaires, and Hunt, who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and who understood better than any American architect how to translate European aristocratic architecture into the American context, designed for Caroline a French Renaissance palace in the style of a Loire Valley chateau, but adapted for an urban Manhattan site. It was not the largest house on Fifth Avenue, not the most ostentatious, but it was perhaps the most perfect, the most refined, a building that announced through every detail that its owner understood taste at the highest level, that she possessed not just money but culture, not just wealth but discernment, and this distinction was crucial to Caroline's entire project, because she was trying to establish that social position could not be bought directly, that there was a difference between having money and being in society, and the house itself was designed to reinforce this argument, to suggest that the people who belonged in its rooms possessed qualities that transcended mere purchasing power. The facade was stone, imported from France at enormous expense, a warm cream-colored limestone that glowed in the morning sun and seemed to absorb light in the evening, giving the building a presence that was simultaneously imposing and elegant. The main entrance was through a porte-cochere that allowed carriages to discharge their passengers under cover, a practical detail that also reinforced class distinctions by ensuring that the wealthy never had to experience the indignity of walking from the street like common people, and once through the entrance, visitors found themselves in an entrance hall that deliberately overwhelmed with its scale and richness, with marble walls and a grand staircase that was designed to be a stage, the physical setting for Mrs. Astor's famous practice of receiving guests while standing at the top of the stairs, literally looking down on those who had come to pay homage, and this spatial relationship, Mrs. Astor elevated, guests below, was not accidental but carefully calculated to reinforce the social hierarchy that the entire house existed to maintain. The ballroom was the heart of the house, a space that could accommodate exactly 400 guests, and this number, the 400, would become synonymous with New York society itself, with the very concept of being in or out, with social acceptance in its most refined form. The origin of this number is disputed, but the most common story is that Ward McAllister, Caroline's social arbiter and the men who did much of the practical work of maintaining her social system, claimed that there were only about 400 people in New York society worth knowing, though another version holds that 400 was simply the capacity of Caroline's ballroom, and the guest list for any given ball was determined by physical space rather than abstract social theory. But regardless of the origin, the number took on totemic significance, becoming a rigid boundary between those who mattered and those who did not, and the psychological violence of this system, the deliberate cruelty of creating a social structure designed to exclude, is something we need to sit with for a moment, because it reveals the dark heart of Gilded Age society. The point was not just to be wealthy or powerful, but to make others feel their exclusion, to create a system where social acceptance became a scarce resource, artificially limited, and therefore valuable in itself. And Mrs. Astor, in creating the 400, was not building a community but constructing a weapon, a tool for enforcing hierarchy and maintaining the boundaries between us and them, between old money and new, between the respectable and the striving, between those who belonged and those who would spend their entire lives trying to belong. The ballroom itself was a study in controlled opulence. Hunt designed it in a French 18th century style, with gilded moldings, crystal chandeliers, mirrors that multiplied the light and made the space seem infinite, and a color scheme of cream and gold that photographed beautifully in the new medium that was beginning to document high society, and every detail of the room, from the height of the ceilings to the arrangement of the furniture to the quality of the light, was calculated to make those who belonged feel their belonging, to create an environment so perfect, so refined, so elevated above ordinary life that simply being in the space confirmed your membership in an elite. And this is one of the subtle but important ways that architectural space does ideological work, by creating environments that feel special, that feel set apart from the everyday world. Buildings like Mrs. Astor's house naturalize inequality, make it feel not just acceptable but beautiful, desirable. Something to aspire to rather than something to abolish, and the dark magic of the Gilded Age mansion was that it could make even the excluded long for inclusion, could make people who were being systematically shut out want nothing more than to be let in, rather than wanting to tear the whole system down. Beyond the public rooms, the ballroom, the dining room that could seat 40 guests at a single table, the various parlors and reception rooms designed for different gradations of intimacy and formality, were the private family quarters, and here we see one of the fundamental contradictions of the Gilded Age mansion. These enormous houses, with their staffs of dozens of servants, their endless rooms and complicated hierarchies, were actually quite uncomfortable as homes, were better understood as theatrical stages or corporate headquarters than as places to live, and the family members who inhabited them often seemed lost in their own residences, rattling around in vast spaces designed for display rather than domesticity, sleeping in formal bedrooms that felt more like museum installations than personal spaces, eating breakfast served by footmen in full livery even when no guests were present, unable to escape the performance of wealth even in their most private moments. Caroline herself, in her later years, increasingly retreated to a small sitting room on the second floor, a relatively intimate space where she could escape the grandeur of her own creation, and there is something profoundly sad about this image, the woman who built the ultimate palace of social power hiding in a small room, perhaps finally exhausted by the endless work of maintaining her position, the constant vigilance required to police the boundaries of society, the unrelenting pressure of being not just Mrs. Astor but the Mrs. Astor, the woman on whose judgment the social order depended. And in her retreat to that small sitting room, we might read a kind of confession, an admission that the entire system was unbearable even for its architect, that the machinery she had built to maintain social order had become a prison for everyone, including herself. But to truly understand Mrs. Astor's house, to see what it really was, you have to go below stairs, into the service areas that occupied as much space as the family quarters but that were designed to be invisible, to function perfectly without ever intruding on the consciousness of those they served. The basement contained the kitchens, the servants' hall where the staff ate their own meals in a hierarchy as rigid as that of the family, the storage rooms for food and wine and linens, the silver vault where the family's enormous collection of serving pieces was kept under lock and key, the laundry rooms where Irish girls spent their days in steam and heat, and the complex mechanical systems that made the house function. The furnaces that heated the building, the water pumps, the gas and later electrical systems, the dumbwaiters and speaking tubes and service stairs that allowed servants to move through the house without being seen. The staff of a house like Mrs. Astor's numbered between 30 and 50 people depending on the season and the level of entertaining. There was the butler, who managed the male staff and was often the highest-paid servant, earning perhaps $1,500 a year at a time when the average American worker earned less than $500, the housekeeper, who managed the female staff and the daily operations of the house, the chef, usually French or French-trained, who commanded a kitchen staff of cooks and kitchen maids and scullery maids who did the actual dirty work of washing pots and scrubbing floors, the ladies' maids and valets who attended to the personal needs of family members, the footmen who served at table and stood attendance in the public rooms, chosen partly for their height and appearance because they were essentially decorative elements, human accessories to the house's grandeur, the housemaids who cleaned the endless rooms, starting at dawn before the family woke and working until late at night, the laundresses, the coachmen and grooms who managed the stables and carriages, and during major balls, dozens of temporary workers hired for the night, including extra waiters, coat check attendants, and security personnel to keep uninvited guests away from the gates. The human reality of this service system, which we have sanitized in period dramas and nostalgic retrospectives, was brutal. Servants worked between 12 and 16 hours a day, had one afternoon off per week if they were lucky, were paid wages that assumed they had no expenses because room and board were provided, were subject to immediate dismissal for any infraction of the complex rules that governed their behavior, were forbidden from having visitors or social lives independent of the house, were often forbidden from marrying, and lived in tiny servants' rooms in the attic, sometimes sleeping 2 or 3 to a room, with no privacy, no heat in winter, and no escape from the house that was simultaneously their workplace, their home, and their prison. The ideology that justified this system was paternalism, the idea that the wealthy had a duty to care for those beneath them, that service in a great house was actually a privilege, an opportunity to learn refinement and manners, to participate, from a subordinate position, in a superior way of life, and that servants should be grateful for the opportunity to serve, should find meaning and identity in their relationship to their employers. But this paternalistic mythology, which was elaborately developed in etiquette books and advice manuals and in the self-justifying rhetoric of the wealthy themselves, could not survive contact with the actual conditions of service, with the reality of 16-hour workdays and wages that barely allowed for survival, with the sexual harassment that female servants endured from male family members and guests, with the constant surveillance and control, with the knowledge that you could be dismissed without notice or reference and end up destitute on the street, with the fundamental disrespect embedded in a system that required you to be simultaneously indispensable and invisible, essential to the functioning of the household but never acknowledged as a full human being with your own needs and desires and rights. The feminist historian Faye Dutton, in her study of domestic service, points out that the relationship between mistress and servant in Gilded Age America was the most intimate and most unequal relationship in American society, more intimate than the relationship between spouses or even between parents and children, because servants were present in every private moment. They dressed you, bathed you, handled your dirty laundry and your bodily wastes, heard your arguments and saw your weakness, knew your secrets and your lies, and yet despite this intimacy, they were afforded no respect, no consideration, no acknowledgement of their humanity, were expected to observe everything and remember nothing, to be present but not there, to vanish into the wallpaper even as they performed the essential labor that made the household function. And this was the foundation, the hidden machinery, the secret truth of Mrs. Astor's house. It was beautiful because dozens of people worked themselves into exhaustion to make it beautiful. It was comfortable because servants labored in discomfort. It was a place of leisure because others had no leisure. It was clean because cleaning women scrubbed floors on their knees. It was warm because someone hauled coal and tended furnaces. It was bright because someone trimmed wicks and cleaned lamp chimneys and later maintained electrical systems. It was filled with flowers because someone arranged them. It smelled good because someone emptied the chamber pots and scrubbed the toilets. It served elaborate meals because someone spent all day in a hot kitchen preparing them. And every pleasure that Caroline and her guests enjoyed was purchased with the labor and dignity of people whose names we do not know, whose photographs do not appear in the society pages, whose lives are recorded only in employment ledgers and occasional police reports when they were arrested for theft or prostitution after being dismissed without references. And this is the dark truth that the house itself was designed to conceal, that the entire aesthetic program of Gilded Age architecture was meant to hide, that the beauty of the building was intended to make you forget that you were walking on the backs of the working class, that your comfort required their suffering, that the price of your elevation was their degradation, and that the whole elaborate system, from the French limestone facade to the gilded ballroom to the 400 to the ritual of calling cards and the hierarchy of dinner service, was designed to naturalize and justify inequality so extreme that it would have made a feudal lord blush. But the house was not just a stage for social performance or a machine for maintaining class hierarchy. It was also, crucially, a tool of economic power, because what happened in Mrs. Astor's ballroom had direct financial consequences in the real world, because invitations to her balls and dinners were worth real money, could make or break business deals, could determine whether a railroad got financed or a steel contract got signed, could affect stock prices and political careers. And this is the aspect of Gilded Age society that we often miss in our nostalgia for beautiful dresses and elegant manners. These social rituals were not separate from economic and political power but were mechanisms for exercising and consolidating that power, were ways of creating networks and alliances among the wealthy, of coordinating their interests, of excluding potential competitors, of identifying reliable partners and freezing out troublemakers. And Mrs. Astor, in her role as social arbiter, was actually functioning as a kind of informal central banker for the American elite, deciding who had access to the networks of power and who did not, who could be trusted with the responsibilities of wealth and who could not, who would be admitted to the inner circles where real decisions were made and who would be kept in the outer darkness. And the genius of the system was that it presented these fundamentally economic and political decisions in the language of manners and taste and breeding, made them seem natural and inevitable rather than arbitrary and self-serving, and allowed the wealthy to coordinate their interests without ever appearing to be engaged in anything as vulgar as a conspiracy. The annual ritual of Mrs. Astor's ball, held every January, became the central event of the New York social season, the moment when the previous year's social climbers learned whether they had succeeded or failed, when new fortunes were tested to see if they could be transmuted into social position, when old families reasserted their claims to superiority, and when Mrs. Astor herself, standing at the top of her staircase receiving guests, physically embodied the principle of social hierarchy. You came to her, you waited for her acknowledgement, you accepted your position in the line that formed at her feet, and in doing so, you participated in a ritual that naturalized your subordination to her judgment, that made inequality seem not just acceptable, but beautiful, elegant, the proper order of things. The preparations for these balls began months in advance and involved not just the Astor household but dozens of businesses and hundreds of workers. Dressmakers and tailors worked overtime to create the gowns and evening wear that guests would wear once and then discard. Florists denuded their hothouses to provide the thousands of flowers that would decorate the rooms for a single night. Caterers prepared elaborate meals. Musicians rehearsed. Hairdressers and ladies' maids worked through the night before the ball to prepare the women's elaborate coiffures. Jewelers brought their most expensive pieces for potential sale or loan. And the whole apparatus of luxury consumption, that peculiar form of economic activity that exists purely to signal status rather than to meet any genuine human need, went into overdrive, pumping money through the economy but in a pattern that primarily benefited those who were already wealthy and left the actual workers, the seamstresses who sewed until Their fingers bled, the delivery boys who carried boxes through winter streets, the kitchen staff who prepared food they could never afford to eat, with barely enough to survive. And on the night itself, the performance was extraordinary. Guests arrived in carriages that clogged Fifth Avenue for blocks, each carriage announcing its occupant's wealth through its design and the quality of its horses and the livery of its coachman, and the arrivals were carefully orchestrated so that the most important guests came neither too early nor too late but at precisely the moment when their entrance would have maximum impact. And as guests entered the house, they passed through a series of spaces designed to progressively overwhelm them, from the entrance hall to the staircase where Mrs. Astor waited, to the ballroom itself where the full spectacle of Gilded Age wealth was on display, the women in dresses that cost as much as a working-class family earned in 5 years, wearing jewelry worth more than most Americans would see in a lifetime, the men in formal wear that required the labor of multiple servants to maintain, and everyone performing a carefully choreographed ballet of manners, where every gesture and word was laden with meaning, where you could rise or fall based on whether you knew the proper form of a dress or the correct way to eat asparagus, where the whole elaborate system of etiquette functioned as a gatekeeping mechanism, a way of identifying who truly belonged and who was merely pretending, and in this sense, the complexity of Gilded Age manners was not arbitrary but functional, was a form of social technology designed to preserve the boundaries of class even as the economic basis of those boundaries was constantly being challenged by new wealth. The menu for one of Mrs. Astor's dinners, preserved in the historical record, gives us some sense of the sheer excess involved, 10 or 12 courses, starting with oysters and caviar, progressing through multiple soups, fish courses, meat courses, game, vegetables prepared in elaborate ways, salads, desserts, fruits, cheeses, each course served with appropriate wines, the whole meal taking 3 or 4 hours to consume, and requiring the service of multiple footmen per guest, and this kind of eating was not about nutrition or even really about pleasure but was another form of display, another way of demonstrating that you had so much wealth that you could literally waste it, could consume in one night what a working-class family would need for a month, and could do so not out of necessity or even hunger but purely as a performance of status, and the economic implications of this are staggering when you multiply it across all the wealthy families of New York, all the dinners and balls and receptions, all the waste and excess and conspicuous consumption that characterized Gilded Age society. Wealth that could have built hospitals or schools or improved tenement housing instead disappearing into one-night displays that benefited no one except the egos of those involved. But we also have to reckon with the fact that these displays, as grotesque as they were, had their defenders, and their defense was not simply self-serving nonsense but tapped into real questions about culture and patronage and the relationship between wealth and art. The argument, made most famously by William Vanderbilt's lawyer when the Vanderbilt balls were criticized in the press, was that the conspicuous consumption of the wealthy was actually a form of economic stimulus, that it kept artisans and craftsmen employed, that it supported industries from dressmaking to architecture to decorative arts, that the wealthy were essentially patrons of the arts in the Renaissance mold, and that their spending, however excessive it might appear, actually trickled down to benefit the broader economy. This argument is not entirely wrong. There were indeed dressmakers and architects and craftsmen who built careers serving the wealthy, and some of them became wealthy themselves, but it obscures more than it reveals, because it ignores the fundamental question of what else that wealth could have been used for, whether the social value of employing a few highly skilled artisans to make luxury goods for the rich outweighs the social cost of leaving the majority of the population in poverty, whether a society that channels its resources into building palaces for individuals while its working classes live in tenements without sanitation is making wise choices, and whether the trickle-down benefits of elite consumption are an adequate substitute for more direct redistribution of wealth through taxation and public spending. And the historical record on this is clear. Gilded Age America, despite its enormous aggregate wealth, had terrible outcomes for ordinary people. Life expectancy in working-class neighborhoods was decades shorter than in wealthy areas, infant mortality was shockingly high, industrial accidents killed thousands of workers every year, tenement conditions were so bad that reformers compared them to the worst slums of Victorian London, public education was underfunded, public health was primitive, and the social safety net was essentially non-existent, so if you lost your job or became ill or injured, you and your family could quickly end up destitute or dead, and this was the direct consequence of policy choices that prioritized the accumulation of private wealth over public goods, that allowed the Astors and Vanderbilts and Rockefellers to amass dynastic fortunes while paying minimal taxes, that treated inequality not as a problem to be solved but as a natural feature of a free market economy, and that elevated the rights of property over the rights of human beings, and this was the world that Mrs. Astor's house both reflected and helped to create, a world where a single family could spend more on flowers for one ball than a coal miner would earn in a lifetime of breaking his body in the darkness beneath Pennsylvania. where the cost of a single ball gown exceeded the annual income of the seamstress who sewed it, where champagne flowed in Fifth Avenue ballrooms while children in tenements 6 blocks east drank water contaminated with sewage, and where this grotesque disparity was not seen as a moral crisis requiring immediate remedy but as the natural order of things, as evidence of civilization's progress, as proof that America had finally achieved the cultural sophistication of Europe, and when defenders of the Gilded Age system argued that the wealthy deserved their wealth because they had earned it through superior intelligence or work ethic or moral character, they were participating in what would later be called prosperity gospel, the pernicious idea that wealth is evidence of virtue and poverty is evidence of vice, an ideology that conveniently absolves the wealthy of any responsibility for the structural conditions that create poverty while simultaneously blaming the poor for their own suffering. The intellectual architecture that supported this system was elaborate and sophisticated, drawing on social Darwinism, classical liberalism, and a selective reading of Protestant theology to create a comprehensive justification for inequality. Herbert Spencer's Survival of the Fittest was enthusiastically adopted by American industrialists who saw themselves as evolutionary victors, men whose wealth proved their fitness to rule, and who believed that any interference with the natural sorting of society into winners and losers would weaken the race and impede progress. William Graham Sumner at Yale argued that the forgotten man, the sturdy middle-class taxpayer, would be crushed by any attempt to help the poor, that charity was actually harmful because it allowed the unfit to survive and reproduce, that the millionaire was in fact a public benefactor whose accumulation of capital was the engine of economic growth, and Andrew Carnegie, in his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, tried to thread the needle between ruthless accumulation and moral responsibility by arguing that it was acceptable to accumulate vast fortunes as long as you eventually gave some of it away, that the millionaire was a trustee for the poor, better equipped to decide how wealth should be used than either the workers who created it or the democratic government that represented them, and all of these arguments, whatever their surface sophistication, ultimately served the same function. They told the wealthy that they deserved their wealth, that their privilege was earned rather than inherited or extracted, that their comfort was compatible with justice, and that they should feel not guilt but pride when they walked through their marble halls while the city around them festered with poverty and disease. Mrs. Astor herself, as far as we can tell from the historical record, did not spend much time worrying about these philosophical questions. She was not an intellectual, did not write treatises on social organization, did not publicly defend her lifestyle against critics, and in fact seemed to operate from an assumption so deep it barely reached consciousness, that social hierarchy was natural, that some people were meant to lead and others to follow, that breeding and refinement were real qualities that separated the worthy from the unworthy, and that her role was not to question this system but to maintain it, to preserve standards, to ensure that society remained the domain of those who understood its rules and could be trusted not to vulgarize it. In this sense, Caroline was a conservative in the truest meaning of the word. She was trying to conserve a social order that she believed was under threat, trying to maintain the supremacy of old New York families against the invasion of new money, trying to hold back a tide of democratization that threatened to dissolve all distinctions and reduce society to a mere marketplace where anything could be bought by anyone with sufficient cash. That she failed in this mission, that the system she built was captured by exactly the kind of new money industrialists she disdained, that her grandson married a Vanderbilt and her great-granddaughter would marry a man whose grandfather had been a poor German immigrant, all of this would have struck her as tragic, as evidence that the center could not hold, that the old verities were dying, that America was indeed becoming the money-obsessed, status-blind democracy that she had spent her life trying to prevent. But we should not mistake her failure for innocence, or see her as a mere anachronism trying to preserve a gentler age, because the social system she maintained was not actually more democratic or more humane than the one that replaced it. It was simply organized around different principles, and the suffering it caused was just as real even if it was masked by better manners and more tasteful architecture. The Irish maids who scrubbed floors in Mrs. Astor's house were not better off because their employer came from an old family rather than a new one. The coal miners who died to heat her ballroom were not consoled by knowing that the Schermerhorns had been in New York since before the Revolution. The garment workers who sewed ball gowns for starvation wages did not benefit from Mrs. Astor's refined taste in music and art, and in some ways, the old money aristocracy that Caroline represented was even more insidious than the new money plutocracy that replaced it, because at least the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers could not pretend that their wealth was anything other than recently extracted from railroads and oil wells, could not claim that their position was sanctioned by tradition or validated by centuries of breeding, whereas the Schermerhorns and their ilk wrapped their privilege in the rhetoric of heritage and culture and breeding, made it seem natural and inevitable rather than contingent and constructed, and in doing so made it harder to challenge, harder to dismantle, harder to see as the human creation that it was. The final years of Caroline's life were marked by a slow, painful decline that carried its own dark symbolism. Beginning around 1904, she started to show signs of what was then called senile dementia, what we would now recognize as probably Alzheimer's disease, and as her mind deteriorated, she increasingly retreated into the past, into memories of her youth, into a New York that no longer existed and perhaps never had existed outside her imagination. There are heartbreaking accounts from these years, Caroline wandering through her mansion in evening dress, preparing for balls that had been held decades earlier, greeting guests who were long dead, standing at the top of her staircase receiving phantoms, the elaborate social machinery she had built continuing to operate in her mind even as the external world moved on without her. Her family, following the custom of the time, kept her condition private, maintained the fiction that she was merely resting or indisposed, and continued to issue invitations in her name even as she became increasingly unable to recognize the people around her or understand where she was. This concealment itself is revealing, the idea that dementia was shameful, that mental illness reflected poorly on the family, that it was better to maintain appearances than to acknowledge human frailty. All of this was of a piece with the elaborate system of pretense and performance that characterized Gilded Age society, where image was everything and reality must never be allowed to intrude. Caroline died on October 30, 1908, at her mansion on 840 Fifth Avenue, with only her daughter Carrie Wilson at her bedside. Her husband William had died 5 years earlier, her son John Jacob Astor IV was absent, he would die 4 years later on the Titanic, one of the wealthiest men to go down with the ship, and the 400, the society she had created and ruled for decades, sent flowers and condolences but could not, gather for one final ball, because the woman who would have had to give them permission to gather, who would have had to stand at the top of the stairs and receive them, was the one who had died. The funeral was private, the burial at Trinity Church Cemetery dignified and brief, and the newspaper obituaries, while respectful, carried an unmistakable undertone of relief, a sense that an era had ended, that New York society could finally move forward, could shed the rigid hierarchies and elaborate rules that Caroline had enforced, could become something more fluid, more democratic, more American, though of course this optimism would prove largely unfounded, because the same patterns of exclusion and hierarchy would simply reconstitute themselves in new forms, with new gatekeepers, new rules, new justifications, but the same fundamental dynamic of some people deciding that other people don't belong, of wealth being used not just to buy comfort but to purchase status, not just to accumulate things but to accumulate power over others. The destruction of Mrs. Astor's house, which began in earnest in 1926, 18 years after her death, was not a random act of urban renewal but was driven by specific, identifiable economic forces that illuminate the broader transformation of Fifth Avenue and of American capitalism itself. By the 1920s, the residential character of Fifth Avenue below 59th Street had become economically inefficient, because land in Midtown Manhattan had become so valuable that using it for single-family residences, even palatial ones, no longer made financial sense compared to building commercial structures that could generate ongoing rental income. The Astor estate, like the Vanderbilt and other Gilded Age fortunes, had been built on real estate, on the principle that you bought land and held it and watched its value increase as the city grew around it, but by the 1920s, this same logic demanded that the mansions come down, that residential property be converted to commercial use, that Fifth Avenue transform from a residential boulevard into a commercial corridor, and there is a certain poetic justice in this, a sense that the very economic system that had allowed the Astors to accumulate their original fortune was now demanding the destruction of its most visible symbols, that capitalism's relentless drive toward maximum profitability was consuming its own monuments, that the children and grandchildren of the Gilded Age millionaires were learning what the rest of America had always known, that in a market economy, nothing is sacred, everything can be bought and sold, and what the market builds the market can also destroy. But the destruction was not merely economic, it was also ideological, cultural, even psychological, because by the 1920s, Americans had developed a deep ambivalence about the Gilded Age and its monuments, an ambivalence that mixed admiration for the beauty and craftsmanship of the mansions with revulsion at the inequality they represented, nostalgia for a more elegant age with anger at its exclusions and injustices, and this ambivalence found its outlet in the strange enthusiasm with which the demolitions were conducted and documented. Newspapers ran extensive photo spreads of the wrecking process, showing the Vanderbilt and Astor mansions being systematically dismantled, the French limestone facades crumbling under sledgehammers, the gilded ballrooms exposed to the open air, the grand staircases collapsing into rubble, and these images were consumed with an appetite that suggests something more than mere curiosity. There was a cathartic quality to watching these monuments to inequality being destroyed, a sense that justice was being done, that the old order was finally being swept away, that the palaces built on the backs of working people were getting what they deserved. That this destruction immediately made way for new monuments to inequality, for skyscrapers and luxury apartment buildings that would serve a new generation of plutocrats, was a contradiction that somehow never quite registered, or if it did register, was rationalized away with the argument that at least the new buildings were more democratic, that anyone with money could live in a luxury apartment whereas the old mansions had been restricted to a hereditary elite, conveniently forgetting that anyone with money was still a tiny fraction of the population, and that the new inequality was just as grotesque as the old, just packaged in a more modern form. The physical process of demolition was itself revealing. The mansions, it turned out, were extraordinarily difficult to destroy because they had been built with a permanence that bordered on the megalomaniacal, with foundations that went down 30 feet or more into Manhattan bedrock, with load-bearing walls made of stone several feet thick, with structural elements that had been over-engineered to survive centuries, and the demolition crews, armed with the best technology of the 1920s, found themselves in something like a battle with the buildings themselves, which resisted destruction with what seemed like conscious malevolence, as if the accumulated pride and wealth and social power embedded in their stones refused to be erased without a fight. It took months to demolish what had taken years to build, and the process generated mountains of rubble, marble and limestone and granite that could not be reused in the steel and glass towers that would replace the mansions, that represented a kind of architectural language that was no longer spoken, and so the rubble was carted away to landfills or used as fill in construction projects around the city, and in this way the physical substance of Mrs. Astor's house, the French limestone and Italian marble and American granite, the materials that had been assembled from around the world to create a palace on Fifth Avenue, were scattered and buried and forgotten, becoming quite literally the foundation for other structures, supporting new buildings from beneath the ground, invisible and unacknowledged, which is perhaps an appropriate metaphor for how American capitalism has always functioned, building new wealth on the hidden labor and sacrifice of previous generations. Incorporating the past into the present without acknowledgement, using history as raw material for future exploitation. What replaced Mrs. Astor's house at 840 Fifth Avenue was Temple Emmanuel, one of the most prominent Reform Jewish synagogues in America, and this replacement has its own resonance, the building that had been the architectural embodiment of Protestant old money exclusivity, where Jews, no matter how wealthy, would never have been received, where Caroline had enforced a social order that placed Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the apex of an ethnic and religious hierarchy, was succeeded by a Jewish house of worship, a building that announced through its very presence that the old hierarchies were dead, that the groups that had been excluded from the 400 now had sufficient wealth and power to claim the most prestigious real estate in the city, that America was becoming what it had always claimed to be but had rarely practiced, a nation where your religion and ethnicity did not permanently bar you from success. And yet this triumphant narrative of democratic progress coexists with a darker reality, that Temple Emmanuel itself was, and is, a wealthy institution serving a wealthy congregation, that the barriers that fell for wealthy Jews did not fall for poor Jews or for poor people of any religion, that what changed was not the existence of hierarchy but merely its composition, who was included and who remained excluded, and that the fundamental structure of inequality, some people living in palaces, or their modern equivalent, while others struggled to survive, remained essentially unchanged, or if anything became more entrenched, as the 20th century progressed and the rhetoric of meritocracy was deployed to justify disparities that would have made the robber barons blush. Standing today at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, trying to conjure the ghost of Mrs. Astor's house, trying to see it through the layers of replacement and forgetting, you confront a fundamental question about memory and architecture and what we choose to preserve, because we could have saved these buildings, we had the technical capacity and the wealth to maintain them as museums or cultural institutions, to preserve them as reminders of a crucial period in American history, and the fact that we chose not to, that we chose instead to destroy them almost completely, leaving only scattered fragments in museums and a handful of surviving buildings that now strike us as bizarre anachronisms, tells us something important about American attitudes toward the past and toward class and toward the very idea of permanence. Americans, it seems, prefer to forget rather than to remember, prefer to embrace the future rather than to preserve the past, prefer to believe that we are always making progress rather than to confront the ways in which the present reproduces the injustices of the past in new forms, and the destruction of the Fifth Avenue mansions was part of this larger pattern of cultural amnesia, this determination to believe that the Gilded Age was an aberration, a temporary lapse from American principles that could be overcome by smashing its monuments and forgetting its lessons, rather than seeing it as one expression of patterns that continue to structure American life, the accumulation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, the use of that wealth to purchase not just luxury but power, the construction of elaborate ideological justifications for inequality, the physical separation of the rich from everyone else, the creation of private spaces of opulence that depend on and require the existence of public spaces of squalor. The irony, the dark comedy of the whole story, is that we are living through another Gilded Age right now, in the early 21st century, with levels of inequality that match or exceed those of the 1890s, with billionaires building megayachts and buying basketball teams and launching themselves into space while American life expectancy declines and homelessness spreads and medical bankruptcy remains a leading cause of financial ruin, with luxury apartments in New York selling for over $100 million while a third of the city's children live in poverty, with a tax code that allows the wealthy to accumulate dynastic fortunes that make the Astor and Vanderbilt fortunes look modest by comparison, and yet we have somehow forgotten the lessons that the destruction of Fifth Avenue's palaces should have taught us, forgotten that societies which allow this level of inequality eventually tear themselves apart, forgotten that monuments to excess eventually face reckonings. Forgotten that the relationship between the ballroom and the tenement, between the palace and the slum, between the 400 and the 4 million, is not sustainable, is not compatible with anything that deserves to be called democracy, is not a stable equilibrium but a powder keg waiting for a spark. Mrs. Astor's house is gone, but the logic that built it, the system that justified it, the habits of thought that naturalized it, all of these persist, mutated but recognizable, and until we are willing to look clearly at what that house represented, at the human cost of its beauty, at the exploitation embedded in every stone of its foundation, at the violence required to maintain the social order it embodied, we will continue to build and destroy and rebuild the same structures over and over. Changing their aesthetic but preserving their essential function, which is to tell some people that they matter and others that they don't, to translate economic inequality into social exclusion, to make hierarchy feel not just natural but beautiful, necessary, desirable, and to ensure that those who benefit from the current arrangement never have to confront the reality of what their comfort costs, never have to see the tenement that makes the palace possible, never have to acknowledge the servants in the basement or the workers in the streets or the children in the slums, never have to face the dark truth at the heart of American capitalism, that our prosperity has always been selective, that our freedom has always been for some and not others, that our democracy has always coexisted with structures of domination that would not look out of place in a feudal kingdom, and that until we are willing to dismantle not just the buildings but the systems they represent, we will remain haunted by the ghost of Mrs. Astor, standing at the top of her staircase, looking down on us, judging us, finding us wanting, and consigning us to the outer darkness where the excluded have always dwelt.